Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is H. Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm talking about 4 players you must draft going into your 2022 fantasy football seasons. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about Kenneth Walker, Trey Lance, Dalton Schultz, and Michael Thomas. Over the course of today's video, I'll of course share with you guys my perspective regarding each of these players, but also the statistics that justify my reasonings as to why you should be joining me this offseason in drafting these players. Now, speaking of drafts, for those of you who are trying to draft in the multitude of best ball tournaments that Underdog Fantasy has to offer, take advantage of that today by signing up with code Andrew. Again, not only do you get the opportunity to have a $100 deposit match via Underdog Fantasy, but if you sign up today using promo code Andrew, you'll go ahead and get a personal email from me that includes my draft rankings for a half and full PPR scoring format, which includes by tier rankings for the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, and defensive positions, along with my top 200 flex players. But that's not all. Those rankings will be sent to you weekly, updated for the entirety of the month of August in order to help you capture a fantastic draft and set yourself up for success for the 2022 season. So again, if you're interested in signing up for Underdog Fantasy, go ahead, check out the link in the description and use promo code Andrew today. I greatly appreciate you guys supporting. Thank you very much. Now, speaking of support, for those of you guys who have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. It takes 2 seconds, and we're making fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season. For the entire month of August, we are, of course, preparing you for your upcoming draft, whether it is strength of schedule, tier lists, must-draft sleepers, breakout players, and much more coming down the line. And as we get into the regular season, we have live streams on Sunday mornings to help you set your lineup, daily rankings from the running back, wide receiver, quarterback, tight end positions. Again, be sure to subscribe because we're going to help you win a championship this year. All right, let's get into today's content, beginning with Kenneth Walker, running back of the Seattle Seahawks. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Kenneth Walker, he was a second-round selection in the 2022 NFL Draft, but prior to course, joining the Seattle Seahawks, he spent 2 years at the University of Wake Forest in the first 2 years of his NCAA career. He had a pretty, average career there. Didn't really get too many opportunities. But in 2021, he hit the transfer portal and he went to the University of Michigan State. There, found a lot of success. Again, 262 rushing attempts for 1,634 yards, 18 rushing touchdowns. And a lot of the stats that you see on the screen is what he was able to accomplish just in his final season. He was the number 1 running back in the NCAA in terms of yards after contact. He was the number 1 running back in terms of missed tackles forced, and he was also the number 1 running back in terms of attempts of 15 or more rushing yards. Obviously, he's an elite level talent. And though Kenneth Walker isn't being touted by many at this current moment in time, his 9th round ADP is a perfect position to currently draft him because in the coming weeks, his ADP is only going to rise as the possibility of him being the full-time starter for the Seattle Seahawks becomes more and more of a possibility. Now, as I'm sure we all know, Kenneth Walker does have competition in this backfield. Of course, a couple weeks ago, we had Chris Carson retire, but Rashad Penny is still in this backfield, and that is what's going to kind of drive the conversation for the rest of the Kenneth Walker argument here. Of course, when we talk about a running back in Kenneth Walker's shoes, who was drafted in the top 50 of his respective draft, and when you compare him against other running backs over the last 5 years who have been drafted within the top 50, we've seen a lot of success from those respective running backs. Of course, if you exclude players who had major injuries that forced them to miss significant amounts of time in their rookie season, like Travis Etienne, Ronald Jones, and Dalvin Cook, the rest of the running backs, the 14 other running backs that were drafted in the top 50 in their respective years, 13 of them were RB3 or better in their given rookie season. So we have a lot of potential with a running back like Kenneth Walker. And again, the Penny conversation comes to the forefront. Again, Rashad Penny played incredible last season. But the issue with Rashad Penny hasn't been his overall play. It's been his availability. Rashad Penny, over the course of his career with the Seattle Seahawks, after being a first-round pick in 2018, has never really been available for the team. In terms of his injuries, in 2018, he broke his finger. Also dealt with a significant knee injury. Then in 2019, had a hamstring strain. Later that year in 2019, tore his ACL. In 2021, in week 1, had a calf injury. And then later in the season, had a hamstring strain once again. Obviously, this man has been plagued with injuries, but many of us experienced the highs of what Rashad Penny could present. Again, from weeks 14 through 18 of the 2021 season, many of us were gifted with the potential of Rashad Penny's overall upside, in which this man was averaging 21.54 fantasy points per game. Over the course of the last 5 games of the Seattle Seahawks 2021 season, Rashad Penny was the offense. He was taking over and dictating games. And a lot of the stats that he was able to put up, for example, leading the league last year in yards per carry. When you go ahead and you look at all the running backs last year that had a minimum of 100 rushing attempts, Rashad Penny had a 6.3 yard per carry average. He was number 1 amongst all running backs in yards per carry after contact with a 4.52 yard per carry average. Again, a lot of potential for an extremely talented running back, but has never been able to stay on the field. When you go ahead and look at the first 4 seasons of Rashad Penny's career, he has only ever had 12 or more opportunities in 8 total games. Only ever put together 8 significant performances. And though I'm sure we all wish that Rashad Penny could stay healthy and play a full 16-game season in his career, unfortunately, it's the nature of the sport. Players are going to get injured and backups are going to come in and take over. And that is the case here with Kenneth Walker. Now, as we approach the 2022 season, we've seen the Seahawks transition here. They've obviously gone ahead and traded Russell Wilson to the Denver Broncos. They're seeing whether or not Geno Smith or Drew Lock is going to be their potential starting quarterback for the 2022 season. But they went ahead and they've begun their rebuilding process by, of course, not only drafting Kenneth Walker this offseason, but drafting 2 significant pieces for their respective offensive line. They brought in Charles Cross to play their left tackle position. They brought in Abraham Lucas to play their right tackle position. In fact, Abraham Lucas was the highest graded run blocking offensive tackle in the NCAA last season that was coming out of the draft. A lot of potential here for those 2 guys to bookend this offensive line and, of course, help the interior of their offensive line that they've obviously gone ahead and made significant improvements with as well. Austin Blythe, he's a top 10 run blocking center. You have Gabe Jackson there, who honestly not the best, but he's at least an average run blocker. And when you take into account what the Seattle Seahawks offense looked like a couple years ago, we go back to 2018. This team was number 1 in terms of running back rushing attempts and running back opportunities in the same season. In 2019, they were number 5 in running back rushing attempts and 8 in opportunities. But over the course of the last couple years, they've had to force Russell Wilson to let the ball loose in order for them to stay in games. And though they've done that, they weren't able to find much success. But in their rebuilding process, with Geno Smith and Drew Lock under center, they are, of course, going to have to run the ball. They're going to get to a point where maybe 25 to 30 of their offensive plays are going to have to be rushing attempts. And though that may not seem like the most optimal, plan of action for a team that typically isn't going to be in very many ball games, considering their overall skill as a team is not there, I think this only opens up more and more opportunity for a running back like Kenneth Walker. Of course, for many of us, we've experienced the days of Chris Carson and how valuable the Seahawks rushing attack can be for our fantasy teams. Now let's talk about worst case scenario. For example, you draft Kenneth Walker with your 9th round selection. And let's say Rashad Penny ends up coming into this offense and dominating off the rip. Obviously, Kenneth Walker is going to get touches. But I'm just saying that the investment that Kenneth Walker provides potentially going into the 2022 season is a lot stronger than some of these other running backs that are being selected in that given round. All right, let's go ahead and let's move on to our next must-draft player, Trey Lance, quarterback of the San Francisco 49ers. Over the last week, in the multitude of drafts that I've gone ahead and presented to you guys, I went ahead and drafted multiple teams with Trey Lance. And though I wasn't given a lot of time in order to kind of go deeper into the minutia as to why I love Trey Lance going into the 2022 season, now I have myself the opportunity. Trey Lance is currently coming off of draft boards in the late 6th, early 7th rounds. Of course, at this current moment, I'll take that price. But we'll talk about exactly why the price has gotten there. But let's talk about what he did in college. Why he was a former, again, 3rd overall pick in the 2021 NFL draft. A lot of quarterbacks nowadays don't have the opportunity of coming into the National Football League, sitting behind a quarterback that was able to get his respective team to a Super Bowl. Again, that's Jimmy G with the 49ers. Let's not overlook the opportunity that is for a respective quarterback to learn behind a veteran, take the experiences that Jimmy G has throughout that season, implement it to your own game, and then develop as a quarterback. We saw Patrick Mahomes do this many years ago, in which he sat behind Alex Smith, then in his 2nd year came out and exploded. I'm not saying that Trey Lance is going to come out and throw 50 touchdowns this year, but what he provides is extremely unique. It's very similar to what Josh Allen provides on a yearly basis, with the combination of having the passing threat along with the rushing game under their belt, and continuing to raise their overall floor of production on a weekly basis, because you know you're going to get 60 rushing yards out of that given quarterback in a week, with the potential of maybe a 6-point rushing touchdown that elevates their game to the next level. But let's talk about this. Obviously, the San Francisco 49ers are a great team. Kyle Shanahan has, pretty much steered them in the right direction since coming to the team in 2017. In fact, since getting here, this team has been one of the top rushing attacks in the National Football League, of course, giving their running backs the 6th most attempts since 2017. When we look at 2021, it was more of the same. This team as a whole was the number 5 team in the National Football League in rushing attempts, number 7 in rushing yards, and number 5 in rushing touchdowns. That is how Kyle Shanahan has built this team and will continue with it in future seasons. And regardless of the quarterback position, I think Trey Lance probably even provides more opportunity for them to run the ball, which is what they want to do on a downly basis. And when we go ahead and look at Kyle Shanahan's portfolio, though many of us will remember the fact that Kyle Shanahan was the offensive coordinator for the Atlanta Falcons team that went to the Super Bowl, many of you may have forgotten the fact that in 2012 and 2013, Kyle Shanahan was the offensive coordinator of the Washington Commanders. And at that time, Robert Griffin III was their respective quarterback. If we go back and look at RG3 stats in 2012, the guy threw for 3,200 yards, 20 passing touchdowns, had 815 rushing yards, and 7 rushing touchdowns. He had a 317.5 fantasy point season and was the number 5 overall quarterback that year. When we compare the amount of yardage that Robert Griffin III was able to accumulate on the ground, whether it was scramble yards or by design run, he had 411 via scrambles and 404 via design runs. Kyle Shanahan is a genius in terms of the offensive play calling and rushing attack. Of course, he's gone ahead and he's over the last year plus been, salivating at the opportunity to use Trey Lance in a rushing attack scheme. It makes it so much more valuable to your offense that you have a mobile quarterback, because that threat obviously is going to keep defensive coordinators up at night and have to keep defensive linemen in the correct positions. Otherwise, if they lose contain, it's off to the races for a very young and athletic quarterback. Let's go ahead and let's talk about what exactly Trey Lance can provide from what we specifically saw from him last season. Obviously, Trey Lance started 2 games, but in the 2.5 games he played, let me go ahead and clarify exactly what that means. The second half of the Seattle Seahawks game early in the season, Jimmy Garoppolo did not come out of the locker room in that second half. Trey Lance was the starter in that second half, so he started technically half of a game there. So, in the 2.5 games that he played last season for the San Francisco 49ers, his overall averages ended out to be 239 passing yards per game with 1.6 passing touchdowns, 64.4 rushing yards, and a 21.61 fantasy point per game average. If you went ahead and took his rushing attempts, which was 12.4 per game on average, and spread that across a 16 to 17 game season, obviously, like we've mentioned in videos past, this is a guy that could very easily get into the conversation of Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, and potentially produce 700 or more rushing yards in this given season. And again, when we've looked at quarterbacks over the last 5 seasons who have done that, who have accomplished 700 rushing yards or more in a given season, they've also averaged 7 or more rushing touchdowns in that given year. On top of it, the 7 quarterbacks that have surpassed 700 yards, a lot of 7s there, 6 of them were top 12 quarterbacks in their given year. The only one that missed it was Lamar Jackson last year due to his respective injury. But when you go ahead and you take into account, yes, Trey Lance is going to run the ball, whether it's designed runs, whether it's scrambles. When you look at the distribution of his yardage last season, it was nearly 50-50 in terms of scramble yards to overall designed run yardage on the ground. But when you compare his statistics to Jimmy Garoppolo in the passing game, that's the question. Are we going to see a significant drop-off in terms of the arm talent that Trey Lance potentially has in comparison to Jimmy G? Let's look at Jimmy Garoppolo's last 34 healthy games that he played during the regular season for the San Francisco 49ers. He averaged 251 passing yards per game and 1.56 passing touchdowns per game, 15.58 fantasy points per game in a standard league. To put it in perspective, those numbers are worse than what Trey Lance was putting up last season in the games that he participated in. If we can go ahead and force Jimmy Garoppolo to be the number 17 overall quarterback last year in fantasy and the number 14 in 2019, if you go ahead and add the huge influx of 700 rushing yards, maybe 7 rushing touchdowns, by all means, there is a huge opportunity for Trey Lance not only being a top 12 fantasy quarterback this season, which I already have him ranked as such, but I can see him being this year's Jalen Hurts. Now, again, last season, Jalen Hurts was going off of fantasy draft boards at a far cheaper price in terms of ADP. He was coming off of draft boards in the 7th, 8th rounds. But the reason why there is such a discrepancy is because the talent that surrounds the player. Jalen Hurts did not have George Kittle, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, Elijah Mitchell, and the genius mind of Kyle Shanahan. He had his own pieces, Devonta Smith, Dallas Goedert, Nick Sirianni. He had his own pieces, but imagine what Trey Lance can accomplish with the elite level team we have here. Again, the defense is at another level. The offensive line is elite. I mean, we're talking about an offense that has been constructed around giving receivers the opportunities in open space, yards after the catch. In 2021, Deebo Samuel and George Kittle were both top 12 receiving options in terms of yak. And in 2019, Deebo Samuel and George Kittle were both top 13 options in terms of yak. There have been so many wide receivers that have found success here. I truly believe that Trey Lance is going to be a fantastic fantasy option. And he's a guy that I'm suggesting you draft this offseason. Now let's go on ahead and move on to our next must-draft player on today's episode, Dalton Schultz. This is going to be the first tight end that I talk about at a pretty extended rate. Obviously, when we go into our respective drafts, we all know it's the top two, Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews. They're coming off of draft boards early. And then the next in line is Kyle Pitts and his potential. And then there's a conversation of maybe do we want to go with Darren Waller? Is he going to get enough targets in the Las Vegas Raiders offense? Are we going to go George Kittle? Can the respective quarterback, Trey Lance, get him involved heavily enough? Is he going to stay healthy? And then Dalton Schultz seems to, by the public's view, be potentially the sixth name at the tight end position. I want to go ahead and first and foremost say I truly do believe that Dalton Schultz is in the same conversation as to what Darren Waller and George Kittle are going to be able to produce this season. But what Dalton Schultz provides is a ginormous discount in terms of ADP. In comparison to George Kittle and Darren Waller, who are coming off of draft boards at the late 4th round, sometimes mid-4th round, I'm seeing a lot of Dalton Schultz get drafted in the 6th round and potentially even fall to the 7th. And that kind of a discount, specifically at the tight end position, when there really aren't that many elite players that can give you weekly production that'll keep you safe at that position, I think Dalton Schultz is a guy that we cannot ignore this offseason. So let's go ahead. Let's talk about the history of Dalton Schultz. If you guys remember, going into the 2020 season, the entire talk around the tight end position regarding the Dallas Cowboys was revolving around Blake Jarwin. Blake Jarwin in that week 1 of the 2020 season ended up tearing his ACL. It's unfortunate, but it's the nature of the sport. And then here comes Dalton Schultz. Schultz and Dak found a lot of success together, from weeks 1 through 6 until, of course, Dak unfortunately had his season-ending injury. But they kind of set a little bit of a baseline there that a lot of us were potentially excited for in 2021. But at the end of 2020, Dalton Schultz ended up finishing as the number 14 overall tight end, despite not having a great quarterback under center. This last year, he finishes the number 4 overall tight end. And when we take into account what Dalton Schultz has been able to accomplish when Dak Prescott is under center, in the 20 games that Dalton Schultz has played with Dak, he's averaged 10.45 fantasy points per game. And if you go ahead and you expand that over a 17-game season, we're potentially going to get upwards of 170 fantasy points from Dalton Schultz, which is exactly where he left off last season with 169 and being the number 4 overall tight end in fantasy. So, if we're pretty much on that kind of same path, what's stopping people from drafting Dalton Schultz earlier? What is the concern? I don't understand it, purely because from the outside looking into this Dallas Cowboys offense, there's a boatload of opportunity, not only in targets, but in the red zone. And from all the pieces that have obviously gotten injured this offseason, are coming back from injuries, or have been traded from this respective offense, the amount of vacated targets going into 2022 is massive. But I kind of wanted to mention a couple more stats. When Dalton Schultz has been given ample opportunity in a game, for example, 6 or more targets, he's averaged 12.4 fantasy points per game in those 14 games with Dak. That's 14 out of his 20 overall contests that they've played together. In the games in which he's been given 5 or more receptions, he's averaged 12.94 fantasy points per game. When he's taken on the NFC East with Dak, he's averaged 14.22 fantasy points per game. A lot of success there. But again, like I mentioned, opportunity is going to be the real key for unlocking the potential of Dalton Schultz. So let's talk about Kellen Moore and what he has provided to this offense. Kellen Moore has been the offensive coordinator for the Dallas Cowboys since 2019. Throughout that span of time, the Dallas Cowboys have targeted their tight ends the 13th most times amongst all teams in the National Football League. Last year, 131 times, which was the 10th most amongst all teams. But that's not the only opportunity that we need to continue to fish for at the tight end position. Like I continue to preach every year, tight ends need to score touchdowns to be valuable prospects on your team. And unless you have a tight end that is doing so, you're not going to find much fun in drafting that player. So when we talk about Dalton Schultz and his potential, last season, he was 9th amongst all tight ends in the National Football League in terms of red zone targets, 14 targets that led to 6 overall touchdowns. Now, when we look at the Dallas Cowboys as a team, as a whole, in 2021, they had the 9th most tight end target opportunities in the red zone, 21 targets that led to 9 receiving touchdowns. Obviously, Dalton Schultz did not account for all of them, but there were other tight ends in this offense that now going into 2022 are no longer there. But that's not the only thing. There are other receiving options that are not going to be available for this offense. Amari Cooper, of course, was traded to the Cleveland Browns this offseason. Cedric Wilson signed a deal with the Miami Dolphins. Blake Jarwin, the backup tight end for this offense, he's gone. They released him. He's done. There's 182 potential vacated targets going into the 2022 season. When we think about this offense, the fact that they threw the ball the 6th most times amongst all teams in the National Football League last season, were one of the most successful offenses in the National Football League. And then you take into account the fact that going into 2022, you don't have Michael Gallup to start the season because he tore his ACL on a touchdown catch in Week 16 against the Arizona Cardinals. And on top of it, James Washington, who they brought in this offseason, ended up breaking his foot. I mean, there is just so much potential opportunity for targets. I mean, for a tight end like Dalton Schultz, who really is being used as a receiver in this offense. He played 81% of the snaps last year. He ran the 3rd most routes amongst all tight ends last year with 548. He can't be taken off the field. And when we look at what Kellen Moore has done with this offense in terms of his play calling, I mean, they've always wanted to have a tight end. I mean, this is an organization that is known for Jason Witten and the legacy that he set. And obviously, Dak Prescott, you go look at his history with tight ends. I mean, go back to 2016. He littered Jason Witten with targets. He wants to use a tight end in this offense, and they continue to do so. When you look at last season, this offense used at least one tight end in their respective formations 96.73% of the time. That's 1,184 out of their 1,224 overall offensive snaps. They use a bunch of 11 personnel, the 10th most amongst all teams last season. And not only that, Dalton Schultz isn't just a receiver. He knows how to block. When you compare all tight ends last season that had a minimum of 130 run blocking attempts, he was the 11th highest ranked player at the position. So again, with only Lamb, Jalen Tolbert, Zeke, and Pollard in this offense, stopping Dalton Schultz from potentially getting targets, it seems to me like there's an extremely high upside that a lot of people are passing on. Now, don't get me wrong. If this team wants to go ahead, sign Will Fuller, sign Cole Beasley, bring in somebody else, trade for somebody else this offseason prior to the return of a Michael Gallup, which really, when you ask Michael Gallup when he's going to potentially return, he already said that week 1 is out of the realm of possibility. He's going to take a while to return from his torn ACL, which again is pretty average. But again, unless this offense brings in another receiving threat, I think Dalton Schultz should very easily be able to get into the conversation of 115 to 125 potential targets. You increase his overall target share in comparison to last year by 15-20%. We're going to see this guy have fantasy production that follows as such and gets him into that same conversation as Kittle and Waller and should be drafted in that same conversation. I mean, when I look at Dak Prescott and the amount of times that he's targeted a number 1 receiver in his own respective offense, going back to 2016, his number 1 receiving threats have had 120, 119, 86, 132, and 96 targets. Again, Dak Prescott does not want to funnel target one player. A lot of people are banging the drum of CeeDee Lamb, but we've never seen it in Dak's repertoire to give a specific receiver 10 targets a game for 16 straight weeks. We've never seen it. And I think that only helps the argument of Dalton Schultz being a primary receiving threat. I mean, there's a reason why Ezekiel Elliott for the last 4 consecutive seasons has had 47 or more receptions a year. Dalton Schultz is going to have a lot of opportunity in 2022. The only question is he going to be on your team? Moving on to our final must-draft prospect for today's episode, we have Michael Thomas. I have mentioned this guy so many times in the last week. Michael Thomas has somehow, some way, kind of gotten into people's minds the same way that Christian McCaffrey did. Christian McCaffrey has, in some people's minds, built a mansion and is living rent-free up there in terms of the injuries that he has scarred people with. And I don't blame you. You draft a guy, you only have one fantasy team in that year, and he ends up just killing your season. I get it. But Michael Thomas, again, in 2019, was the number 1 overall wide receiver in fantasy. He broke the record for the most receptions by a wide receiver in a single season. Let's not, forget what he was able to accomplish. And yes, he's missed the last 2 seasons with this nagging ankle injury that has continued to re-aggravate. And he obviously, got it misdiagnosed. And then he played on it and continued to avoid surgery, then had to eventually have surgery. It was a complete mess. There was also, trade rumors as to whether or not him and Sean Payton had a great relationship. There was so much baked in there over the last 2 years. But we're past that now. You go look at what Michael Thomas has been doing at training camp. He's back, guys. And purely the ADP of Michael Thomas speaks to that. When we go to Underdog Fantasy, this man was drafted in the 8th round just a couple weeks ago. But then it slowly crept to the 7th round, then to the 6th round. And now is being selected oftentimes in the 5th round of drafts. And you may be wondering, Andrew, why is that the case? Well, it's pretty simple in my eyes. Michael Thomas is back. And regardless of who is playing quarterback for this respective New Orleans Saints offense, he is going to continue to be an elite wide receiver like he has been in the past. Again, from 2016 to 2019, regardless of the fact that he had Drew Brees, Teddy Bridgewater, a little bit of Taysom Hill every now and then, he was still a very valuable wide receiver. He went from being the number 7, 6, and then the number 1 wide receiver in 2019. He's been a top 7 wide receiver every healthy year of his career. So why not continue to trust the player that over the course of his career with the New Orleans Saints, with Drew Brees, was averaging over 15 fantasy points per game, and even with Teddy Bridgewater under center, in the 7-game span between 2018 and 2019, he was averaging over 16 fantasy points per game. Again, there is so much potential for Michael Thomas. In a 5th round selection, a couple weeks ago when I was getting him in the 7th, I was happy about it, but I'm still happy about it in the 5th because this is a player that used to be a 1st or 2nd round selection every year. But because of Jameis Winston, because of the uncertainty of his ankle, people have begun to spin a narrative that he'll never be the same. He'll never continue to be that top level wide receiver that we saw in the past. And there's always a possibility that that's the nature of the sport of football. You're good until you're not, and you fall off that cliff and you retire. But going into 2022, that's not the case for one Michael Thomas. Michael Thomas is ahead of the pack, in my opinion. He's a wide receiver that in his career, whenever he's been targeted 8 or more times, he's averaged over 17.5 fantasy points. Anytime he gets 7 or more receptions in a game, he's averaging 19.9 fantasy points per game. From 2016 through 2019, Michael Thomas had 18 games of 10 or more catches. 35 games of 7 or more catches, 19 games of 100 or more receiving yards, 32 receiving touchdowns throughout that span of time. We're talking about top tier talent, and I understand there's no more Drew Brees, there's no more Sean Payton, and that's going to certainly play a factor in these overall upside. I'm not saying Michael Thomas is going for 150 receptions in a year. That's no longer that's completely out of the realm of possibility. That's no longer on the table. But we still have the same offensive coordinator that was there when Sean Payton was. Pete Carmichael has been the offensive coordinator for the New Orleans Saints since 2009. This offense is going to maintain as it once was, and they're going to continue to give Michael Thomas the ball in the same opportunities he was once given. And for those of you who are of the opinion that Jameis Winston just isn't enough for this respective wide receiver, let's go back to 2019. Forget it. You know what? Let's go back from 2015 through 2019. Jameis Winston with Mike Evans, his number 1 wide receiver. Mike Evans in those seasons averaged 13.95 fantasy points per game in 68 games played with Jameis Winston. 9.49 targets per game. I understand that Jameis Winston in 2019 threw a bunch of interceptions, but that doesn't matter for us in fantasy football. We're talking about the extension of him, the receiver that is getting those overall opportunities. Again, a lot of people don't remember how good Jameis Winston was at throwing the ball deep down the field, 20 plus yards. In 2019, He was number 1 in all 4 categories: passing attempts, completions, yards, and touchdowns when it was in the matter of 20 or more yards down the field. This has never been the case for Michael Thomas. He's always had noodle arm Drew Brees, who has thrown slant routes. Again, Michael Thomas has made a career out of yards after the catch. Again, over the course of his career, has always been in the top 6 of that category every single season, but has very much so been a shallow route runner. I mean, you go back to 2019, his average depth per target was 8.2 yards. He's running slants, but if you unlock his receiving game in terms of depth of target and you get him 20 yards down the field, whew, the sky's the limit, especially considering he is a receiver that, according to Pro Football Focus, who was the number 2 overall wide receiver against man coverage and zone coverage back in 2019. You bring in Jarvis Landry. You bring in Chris Olave. The first time this team has had a number 2 actual wide receiver in this offense. Obviously, the number 2 receiving option has been Alvin Kamara over the last couple years. But if you bring in another threat the defenses have to contain and keep an eye on, it opens up more opportunity for Michael Thomas. Again, these are my 4 must-draft players going into the 2022 year that I believe you guys should be joining me in drafting. Hopefully you enjoyed today's content. Be sure to like down below and subscribe to the channel. Again, if you want my draft rankings, be sure to go ahead and sign up for Underdog Fantasy today. I mean, you could even go to my Patreon. The link is down in the description. But you can go ahead and sign up for a subscription there. That's $10 a month. Or go to Underdog Fantasy, use promo code Andrew, deposit $10 there, get a $10 match via Underdog Fantasy, get $20, potentially draft 5 teams via the Puppy 3 Best Ball Tournament, and maybe you get lucky, win some money back, get yourself in a great position. But again, more details regarding my draft rankings are down in the comment section. I have a pinned message down there for those of you who are interested. Tomorrow, we'll talk more fantasy football, more draft stuff in order to help you prepare for the 2022 season. And until then, thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you guys. Peace.